Final Fantasy XIV is a surprisingly dated game in many aspects. For a lot of players, this is simply an accepted fact that that's just how Final Fantasy XIV is. And sometimes, indeed, it is simply a decision whether you do one or the other in game design. But other times, a mechanic or feature seems to be the way it is just because it was made like that initially and just left that way. I want to talk about some of this jank, and if you know of some odd jank that you feel like I ignored or overlooked, do let me know about it in the comments. To start off the jank, let's count it down this time. Number 10. Buff and debuff caps. It is perfectly possible you've gone through the game without ever needing to worry about this. However, a problem that has pretty much never been dealt with, but has been in the game, effectively since A Realm Reborn, is the existence of a buff-debuff cap. Or more precisely, the low ceiling of the buff-debuff cap. What this means is that there is a maximum limit to how many buffs and debuffs a single unit, player or otherwise, can be affected by, and when this limit is reached, effects on top of that will simply be dodged, in the same way that a healer using rescue on someone who isn't in combat simply dodges. Now, a cap like this can typically be there since, for instance, in programming, it is not a bad call to choose to make an array a certain size, instead of just appending it each time. The problems tend to arise if the cap is set too low, because often, if the cap is extremely high, then it might as well not be a cap. We won't know the difference. In Final Fantasy XIV though, the cap is a combined 30 between buffs and debuffs. 30 sounds like a lot, but this amount is reachable through normal play. Although it is possible to deliberately avoid running into it by planning around it. That still isn't great. How would one reach 30 buffs and debuffs naturally? Most players have 2 free company buffs, and in a hard duty likely have a food buff and may in that very moment have a gem draft running. Let's say that you're a Viper with a Dancer partnering you. For a big raid-wide overlapping with a 2-minute burst, a Dancer could provide you with 8 separate buffs. Let's say your Warrior also uses Shake It Off and just so happens to give you Nascent Flash for this. That's another 5 buffs. For like 4 seconds, then it becomes 4 buffs. Astrologian happens to give you a damage card, use Collective Unconscious and Celestial Opposition with Divination, that's another 5. A Scholar's there putting up a Galvanize and Sacred Soil, a Pixamancer uses Starry Muse with Tempera Grasa, and a Gunbreaker uses Heart of Light. Did you keep count? That's 27. So anyway, your rotation produces honed things, a speed buff, a damage buff, and oh no, that's 30! Hopefully you don't have a Dragoon using Battle Litany too, and God forbid the boss has anything to add. Granted, this is a piece of jank that reasonably few players actually have to deal with on a daily basis, and admittedly, I don't picture very many raid-wise that require that much. But this is a problem that has come and gone since, at the very least, Stormblood. If this was a problem even before then, please do let me know. However, in Eureka, it was a very common problem that jobs that relied on dots for their damage just simply couldn't do it on Fates in Eureka, as the 30 debuffs limit would be reached almost instantly, as back in Stormblood, there was almost more jobs with a dot than without, and some even had 2 or 3. You could argue this was sort of resolved over the years by less and less jobs having debuffs or dots to maintain, but then jobs instead got more and more buffs, with many actions producing 2 or 3 in a single button press. Comment Walker, the buff cap on players caused problems during the top Ultimate raid, and while complaints were raised, not much was done about it. And then with the current raid tier, Arcadian's Cruiserweight, Howling Blade's Savage Encounter delivers such massive quantities of stack markers and raid wides that it sometimes, probably rarely, but actually causes problems when teams overstack cooldowns during a burst window, again causing problems with the buff-debuff cap. Yes, of course, you can just play around it, but it is a little funny when simply doubling the cap might actually remove the problem for a long time, if not for good. especially when it's been around for so long. Number 9. Macros. These can be super handy to do commands for you in quick succession, or sometimes even use certain actions in a specific context, like using a healing spell on whatever your cursor happens to be hovering over. However, macros have some odd design choices that tend to make them objectively worse than pressing an action normally. Why? When you press an action in Final Fantasy XIV, the game queues it to use for a reasonable amount of time. This is also known as input buffering. You can press the next action you wish to use over half a second before it is actually ready, and the game will make sure it goes out when it can. This is not the case when you use macros. Macros are played one line per frame of gameplay, meaning that if you made a macro where each line used a different weapon skill and your GCD was up exactly on frame 12, then the 12th line would be the action that would be used. To be clear, macros do not have this queuing system, which might make sense since most items don't have it, and it was actually somewhat recent in Final Fantasy XIV's history that Sprint and Gem Drafts got the feature added to them. On the one hand, it could be argued that macros are deliberately designed to be inferior to pressing actions to deter players from using macros in combat, or even for other conveniences. On the other hand, the fact many items simply don't have this feature either could be explained by the buffering itself needing to know what action it is to know to buffer it. Not to mention, some macros rely on this frame-by-frame playing feature to work right, and input buffering on top of that doesn't really make sense. Still weird though. Number 8. Buff Enmity. This one actually makes pretty good sense at face value. Whenever you apply a buff to someone, a token amount of enmity is produced on anything that someone is in combat with. This ensures that you're put in combat with the same enemies that the one you're helping is in combat with, and means you can't just heal from the sidelines without any danger to you. However, where it sometimes can get a little weird is that some actions generate buff enmity a lot more frequently than others, like Ninja's hand signs, and other times, like in the case of tank stances, these benefit from the buff itself, making the enmity pool significantly bigger, although not enough to actually compete with a real attack. But the main way this actually causes minor problems in content is because of how it can sometimes steal aggro for just a moment when, say, a healer puts an effect on the tank right as they enter combat, causing some of the enemies to start running towards the healer, and due to the surprisingly slow response rate, even if the tank hits them as they pass, they might take a while longer to turn around and change course, making this rather innocuous jank a much bigger deal to some players. Number 7. Cure and tank potency. Potency is a number the game gives that can be used to compare actions on a job. If one action does 200 potency and another does 100, then the 200 one obviously does twice the damage of the 100 one, assuming there isn't some trait or something that boosts one but not the other. But you get the idea. A lot of players have simply accepted that the potencies of two different jobs simply cannot be trusted to be comparable. However, if you had the exact same stats between two jobs, then when taking into account the various damage bonuses, then 100 potency is 100 potency. Doesn't matter if it's a healer or a DPS, a ranged physical or a mage, as long as you account for all the damage bonuses, at the end of the day, 100 potency is 100 potency baseline. Well, except for cure potency and tank damage potency. Of course, it is perfectly possible that all the other jobs having explainably perfectly comparable potencies between each other by sheer coincidence, and actually just so happens that tank is an outlier by design. However, it is worth noting that if a tank has the same stat line as a DPS, then 100 tank potency only adds up to 80 potency from a DPS by this self-same measure. What gets even weirder about this is that this exact same observation is true for all cure potency. This is very obvious if you take something like a White Mage's Glare and compare its damage with how much healing Cure 1 does. While Cure 1 should be doing nearly 50% more healing than Glare does damage, it tends closer to a sixth more. For the tank portion, it is very possible this can be explained by the Shadowbringer's tank stand simplification. Before Shadowbringers, tanks had to choose between a tank stance for Enmity and taking less damage, but also dealing about 20% less damage, or a damage stance that increased their damage output a smidge. With Shadowbringers, simply baking in the reduced damage from the tank stance would mean that there would be no need to change all the tank potencies to maintain a similar balance to what was already there. For the cure potencies, my best guess, I kid you not, is that in actual A Realm Reborn, the only jobs that had cure potencies were White Mage and Conjurer, and Scholar and Arcanist. All other jobs had either straight lifesteal percentages or healed for a percentage of HP. White Mage and Scholar also relied on different stats for attacking and healing, meaning that it would not be very obvious if the math was wrong and 100 cured potency didn't add up to 100 damage potency by accident. I suggest this as a possibility, partly due to the observation we made earlier in Dawntrail that Summoner and Scholar pets didn't benefit from a trait boosting their potencies, which was eventually resolved, but the game did actually run with this massive nerf of a bug for a couple months before people started giving it any attention. Number 6. Healing effect inconsistencies. A very strange type of jank is how unintuitive healing increasing and decreasing effects are. Aside from traits like Maim and Mend, there is no such thing as a normally accessible job action that increases all healing done, only received. However, between healers, every single one has access to a buff that increases all healing magic, which means only spells. Whether this is some sort of spaghetti code or other type of jank, the explanation for this one might also be found in actual A Realm Reborn, as originally, all ability-based healing was percentage-based. Second Wind, percentage of HP. Lost Rate, percentage of HP. Benediction, technically HP percent. And now you might say Whispering Dawn, but nay, I say, Whispering Dawn was a spell in A Realm Reborn. And simply put, percentage-based healing is entirely unaffected by healing increasing and decreasing effects, with the sole exception of effects that, like, say, all healing received is set to 0. This is a game design choice, of course, but it does make sense that an action healing for 25% of your HP always heals for exactly that much, both for good or bad. It makes it more intuitive, and by such a design choice, there was no need to have the ability to increase healing done by abilities, specifically. Number 5. Telegraph Snapshotting. To my knowledge, Final Fantasy XIV is, among all MMOs, by far the one that stretches the definition of tag your it the most. An attack snapshot usually means that the game already determined you didn't move out in time and the attack will hit you. In MMOs, typically, the moment the snapshot occurs is extremely close to when the attack actually lands. The big laser beam the enemy is charging up snapshots as the laser is fired. Makes sense. In Final Fantasy XIV, however, it is surprisingly common that the enemy will show a telegraph, those orange circles and whatnot, and eventually it disappears, indicating the snapshot, but then the enemy goes for like a coffee break and walks the dog before actually making use of that snapshot, sometimes known as a prepare event, I believe. For veteran players, this is just how it is in the game. But for newer players, this looks absolutely ridiculous and can induce many a "but I dodged it!" exclamations. This one, however, can mostly only be solved by the developers choosing to make the attack animations and the attack's landing be much faster after a snapshot occurs, and that is just a design choice, really. Number 4. Dot snapshotting. I would call it a somehow archaic RPG design choice that does add complexity. However, it is one that Final Fantasy XIV still swears by. The way that it works is simply that when you apply a damage over time or healing over time effect, the game takes account of your state and your target's state at the exact moment the effect is applied, and uses that to calculate the damage or healing that will be done. It makes sense, as if you get a power boost and cast a spell on an enemy, that spell should have that power boost for the entire duration of it, right? Imagine an archer firing an arrow with all their might and then being exhausted afterwards and because of that exhaustion, the arrow slows down mid-flight. What? Yeah, that makes no sense. However, in many RPGs, especially MMORPGs, it is more and more common for effects like dots to simply scale in real time with the owner. This accomplishes two things. First, it makes the swinginess of the potential power of a dot being applied in a very slim window of opportunity less swingy. Second, it allows the player to focus on maintaining the dot rather than timing it. This, of course, reduces the potential skill involved in dot maintenance, but for a significant number of players, the entertainment in a dot-centric job or class is in said maintenance, and the bursty style might take away from that by putting more emphasis on when you apply the effect, rather than your consistency. A common thing I've heard is indeed that many players will see a dot in a job's toolkit and, regardless of potency numbers, may assume that it should be maintained, because that's what you do with dots. Dot snapshotting kind of clashes with that. Number 3. Auto-attacking. This one is a smaller piece of jank, but appears in a couple ways. All physical jobs employ auto-attacks as a substantial amount of their damage output, but due to the quantity of animations in a rotation, the way they usually appear is the damage number simply popping out during some other wholly unrelated animation. The second point where auto-attacks get weird is that they are the only single-target attacking actions that can be performed without phasing your target, for whatever reason. And the final thing is how auto-attacks interact with casters and casting. It is the only way a caster job can make use of their strength attribute, and interestingly, highlights a different kind of jank in the game, which is the fact that caster jobs gain so little strength on level up that initially their auto-attacks will increase in damage as they level up, but at a certain point, the damage starts to lower as you level up, and this applies for all casters, with the exception of the Arcanist ones that for some reason go to the gym on Sundays. Add to this that auto-attacks cannot take place while casting and actually pause entirely when you begin casting, but resume half a second before you finish casting, meaning you can sneak in an auto-attack while you haven't actually finished casting your spell. This half second is also where the slide casting window takes place. Another piece of jank that I think has just become a feature at this point. Number 2. Animation lock. Long story short, whenever you use an action, you're locked into it and can't use another for a set amount of time. This time frame is approximately 0.6 seconds, plus your latency for some reason, plus some handling time from the server, which varies between about 30 and 50 ms usually, depending on where you are, with shorter times usually being in duties while standing still. Yes, really. That's a slight exaggeration, but you get the point. What makes this one particularly interesting is that unlike many of the other janky mechanics that I could point a finger back to ARR as the reason, this one was actually way worse in actual ARR. To just give a simple example, a Dragoon would pretty much always clip their GCD when using jump. This is obviously not the case anymore, but this kind of observation probably explains why in actual ARR, openers tended to have way more than double weaves, just weaving every single buff one by one before doing GCDs. If the animation lock was way longer or super inconsistent and perhaps less well understood, it would make a lot better sense to just weave everything and get it over with. However, where the problems arrive in current day is that whether you're able to play certain jobs properly can be dependent on your latency. To put it into perspective, on 20 ms, which is what I tend to play on, double weaving on the optimal 1.93 or 1.94 monk GCD is shaky at times, because even under the perfect circumstances, 20 ms plus the handling time makes the lock 0.65 seconds, and you would technically need it less than 0.643 seconds to be consistent. It usually works, but it's still very strange. And finally, number 1. Cast attacks. This one is a piece of jank that has gradually faded from the game simply due to slipping into irrelevancy. Whenever you cast an action, it takes 0.1 seconds longer than it says it does. When you cast something with a cast time longer than the GCD, you can naturally observe this 0.1 second by the fact that even if you spam the spell, there is somehow enough time between casts that the cast bar can fully disappear and reappear before you cast again. And no, it is not because it fades out before the cast bar fully fills. Because most cast times are shorter than the GCDs they are attached to now, cast attacks typically only comes up in very weird cases like tight timings and animation locks, or notably, Black Mage. If your cast takes 2 seconds, it actually takes 2.1 seconds. If you then choose to weave something, it takes, a bit more than 0.6 seconds, which will be 0.2 seconds longer than the GCD, not 0.1. Next, if you cast something with a cast time of 3 seconds, it is actually 3.1 seconds, which is the case for Blizzard and Fire too. The way this piece of jank has gradually faded from relevancy is simply because the jobs that had cast times equal to or longer than the GCDs on their main spells basically had them all changed. Once upon a time, Stone was 2.5 seconds, Ruin was 2.5 seconds, Fire 1 was 2.5 seconds. You get the gist. They certainly aren't anymore. But the jank still holds on for dear life through a few select actions that remain. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before input buffering was applied to Sprint, it was common to use a Sprint macro that called the action every single line for up to 15 lines, to effectively produce some sort of pseudo input buffering, as some buffering is always better than no buffering.